There are some stories in Hollywood that never quite get told the way they should. Stories about real friendships, genuine respect, and moments that defined what it truly meant to be a man in an industry full of pretenders. For years, people have whispered about the relationship between two of the most iconic figures to ever grace both the silver screen and television. One was known for his charismatic smile and devil-may-care attitude. The other was a towering figure of strength and integrity who literally came back from death itself. What you're about to hear isn't just another Hollywood tale. This is about something deeper, something that went beyond the cameras and the fame. This is about what Burt Reynolds finally revealed about Clint Walker, and why it took him so long to speak these truths out loud. Picture this. It's 1969, and the desert landscape of the American West is being transformed into a movie set. The film is Sam Whiskey, a comedy western that would bring together three remarkable talents. Burt Reynolds was at a pivotal point in his career, transitioning from television heartthrob to movie star. But standing beside him on that set was a man who would forever change his perspective on what it meant to be strong, both physically and in character. That man was Clint Walker, and the story of their connection is one that Hollywood has kept quiet for far too long. Clint Walker wasn't just another actor. Born in Hartford, Illinois in 1927, he grew up during the Great Depression, a time when boys became men far earlier than they should have had to. While other kids were playing, young Clint was working. By the age of 9, he was already contributing to his family's survival. This wasn't the manufactured toughness you see in method actors today. This was real. This was a man forged in the crucible of genuine hardship, and it showed in everything he did. After leaving high school at 16, Walker didn't head to acting classes or audition for plays. He joined the Merchant Marine at 17, serving his country during World War II. The ships he worked on delivered supplies and troops across dangerous waters, facing threats that most people couldn't even imagine. When the war ended, he didn't settle into a comfortable life. He worked his way across the country, taking jobs in oil fields, on riverboats, in factories. Every experience carved away the unnecessary, leaving only the essential. By the time Hollywood discovered him, Clint Walker was already more of a man than most actors could ever hope to portray. The story of how Walker became Cheyenne is the stuff of legend. He was working as a doorman at a Las Vegas hotel when a Hollywood agent spotted him. Not because he was trying to be noticed. Not because he was networking or schmoozing. Simply because his physical presence was impossible to ignore. Standing at 6 feet 6 inches, with a chest that measured an astounding 50 inches and a waist of just 34 inches, Walker looked like he'd been carved from granite by the gods themselves. But here's what made him different from every other physically impressive person in Hollywood. He hadn't achieved this through obsessive gym routines or bodybuilding competitions. His strength came from real work, real life, real challenges. When Cheyenne premiered in 1955, it became a phenomenon. But Walker never let the fame change who he was fundamentally. While other stars were demanding special treatment and throwing tantrums, Walker showed up on time, did his work with professionalism, and treated everyone from the studio head to the newest crew member with the same respect. This was the man that Burt Reynolds would come to work with in 1969, and it was an experience that would stay with Reynolds for the rest of his life. Now, Burt Reynolds had his own impressive background. Born in 1936 in Lansing, Michigan, Reynolds was a talented football player who seemed destined for the NFL before a car accident derailed those dreams. He turned to acting, and his natural charisma quickly made him a star on television. But Reynolds had something that a lot of actors lacked. He had enough self-awareness to recognize true greatness when he saw it, and he wasn't too proud to learn from it. When the cast of Sam Whiskey came together, Reynolds found himself sharing scenes with not just Clint Walker, but also the talented Ossie Davis and the beautiful Angie Dickinson. But it was Walker who made the deepest impression on him. There are photographs from the set that tell their own story. One image, in particular, has become somewhat famous among classic Hollywood fans. It shows Clint Walker literally lifting both Burt Reynolds and Ossie Davis off the ground at the same time, one in each arm, while all three men are laughing. It looks like a staged publicity shot, but those who were there said it was just Walker playing around between takes, demonstrating his strength as casually as someone else might tell a joke. Reynolds would later talk about this, though not in the way you might expect. He didn't focus on the physical feat itself. What stuck with him was how effortlessly Walker did it, and how there was no showboating involved. Walker wasn't trying to prove anything. He was just being himself, and his natural strength was simply part of who he was. Reynolds said that watching Walker move through the world with that kind of power, but wielding it with such gentleness and humility, taught him something profound about real masculinity. See, Hollywood in the 50s, 60s, and 70s was full of men trying to project toughness. Method actors would immerse themselves in darkness to seem more serious. Action stars would pump themselves up in the gym and flex for the cameras. But Walker never had to try. He just was. And Reynolds recognized that this authenticity was something rare and precious. In interviews years later, Reynolds would describe Walker as possibly the most physically perfect man he'd ever seen. But he always followed that up by saying that Walker's character was even more impressive than his physique. The filming of Sam Whiskey gave Reynolds a front-row seat to Walker's approach to both acting and life. While some stars treated supporting cast and crew as invisible, Walker made a point of knowing everyone's name. When technical problems delayed filming, instead of retreating to his trailer and complaining, Walker would chat with the crew, often helping to solve problems with a practical wisdom that came from his years of real work before acting. Reynolds watched all of this and absorbed lessons that would serve him throughout his career. But what really cemented Reynolds' respect for Walker was something that happened 2 years after they worked together. Something so extraordinary that when Reynolds first heard about it, he could barely believe it was true. In May of 1971, Clint Walker went skiing at Mammoth Mountain in California. It was supposed to be a relaxing day off, a chance to enjoy the natural beauty of the mountains. But as Walker was attempting to disembark from a ski lift, something went catastrophically wrong. He fell, and a ski pole pierced directly through his chest, penetrating his heart. Let me pause here because the severity of what happened cannot be overstated. This wasn't a close call. This wasn't a near miss. A ski pole had gone through Clint Walker's heart. When the emergency responders got him to the hospital, 2 different doctors examined him and pronounced him dead. Dead. One of the strongest men in Hollywood, a man who had survived the Depression, World War II, and decades of demanding physical work and stunts, had apparently met his end in a freak skiing accident. But then something happened that defied medical explanation. A third doctor, one who was passing through the hospital and heard about the case, decided to check one more time. And he detected something. The faintest signs of life. A heartbeat so weak that 2 other trained physicians had missed it. They rushed Walker into emergency surgery, working frantically to repair the damage to his heart. The surgery was successful, but no one expected Walker to really recover. The trauma to his heart should have left him permanently weakened, if he survived at all. Doctors told him his acting career was almost certainly over. He would be lucky, they said, if he could live a normal life, let alone perform the kind of physical work that his roles demanded. Clint Walker heard all of this, and then he did what Clint Walker always did. He got to work. Using the same determination that had carried him through every challenge in his life, Walker approached his recovery with a focused intensity. He listened to his doctors, but never accepted their limitations as final. He modified his fitness routine, working with what his body could do rather than lamenting what it couldn't. He meditated, he prayed, and he kept his mind fixed on a goal that everyone else thought was impossible. He was going to act again. Just 2 months after being declared dead, just 8 weeks after a ski pole pierced his heart, Clint Walker was in Spain filming his next project. Let me say that again because the timeline is almost unbelievable. 2 months. Not 2 years. Not after a long, cautious return to light activity. 2 months, and he was back on set, performing in a physically demanding role. The doctors couldn't explain it. His fellow actors couldn't believe it. But Walker just shrugged it off with characteristic humility, attributing his recovery to good medical care, faith, and the support of his loved ones. When Burt Reynolds heard about Walker's accident, he was devastated. They had become genuine friends during the filming of Sam Whiskey, and the thought of losing Walker was painful. But when Reynolds heard about the recovery, about how Walker had literally come back from death and returned to work in record time, his respect transformed into something approaching awe. Reynolds would later say that Clint Walker had taught him the most important lesson about being a man. It wasn't about how hard you could hit or how tough you could talk. It was about having a core of integrity and determination that no circumstance could break. Reynolds talked about this in various interviews over the years, though often in passing, as though the full weight of his feelings was too personal to fully articulate in public. But those who paid attention could hear the genuine admiration in his voice whenever Walker's name came up. Reynolds would describe Walker as a man who never bragged, never postured, never felt the need to prove himself because he had nothing to prove. His life spoke for itself. And here's something that made Walker even more remarkable. After his near-death experience, after literally being pronounced dead and coming back, Walker didn't become someone who dwelled on the trauma or used it for sympathy or publicity. He didn't write a tell-all book or give dramatic interviews about seeing the light or having visions. He simply returned to his life and his work with the same quiet professionalism he'd always shown. When reporters asked him about the accident, he would confirm the facts, express gratitude for the medical care he received, and then change the subject. That wasn't false modesty. That was a man who understood that dwelling on near death wasn't as important as living well. Reynolds saw in Walker a kind of authenticity that Hollywood rarely produces. Most actors, Reynolds included to some degree, create a persona for the public. They craft an image, manage their brand, calculate how they're perceived. But Walker never seemed to engage in any of that. He was the same person in front of the camera as he was behind it, the same in interviews as he was in private conversations with friends. This consistency, this lack of artifice, made him unique in an industry built on illusion. The friendship between Reynolds and Walker continued over the years, though they didn't work together again on screen. But they would cross paths at industry events, and Reynolds always made a point of seeking Walker out. Those conversations, Reynolds would later reveal, were some of the most valuable of his life. Walker had a way of cutting through the nonsense that surrounded Hollywood success. He would listen to Reynolds talk about his career challenges or personal struggles, and then he would offer advice that was always practical, always grounded in common sense, and always delivered without judgment. One story that Reynolds shared, though he was always careful not to betray Walker's privacy, involved a time when Reynolds was going through a particularly difficult period. His career was in transition, his personal life was complicated, and he was questioning a lot of his choices. He ran into Walker at an event, and they ended up talking for hours. Walker listened, and then he said something that Reynolds never forgot. The exact words remain private, but the essence was this: fame, success, even the adoration of millions of people. None of that mattered if you couldn't look at yourself in the mirror and respect the man looking back at you. Walker told him that the work you do, the roles you choose, the way you treat people when the cameras are off, those are the things that define who you are. Everything else is just noise. Reynolds took that advice to heart. While he continued to be a major star, enjoying the perks of fame and success, he also became known as someone who was genuinely kind to people behind the scenes. He mentored young actors, not with a superior attitude but with genuine care. He fought for projects he believed in, even when they weren't the most commercial choices. And when he talked about his own life and career in his later years, he often circled back to the lessons he'd learned from people like Clint Walker. What's particularly interesting is how Walker's influence on Reynolds played out in Reynolds' own attitude toward physicality and aging. Reynolds was famously handsome, and like many actors, he struggled with the aging process. He made some choices regarding his appearance that he later regretted, including cosmetic procedures that didn't turn out the way he'd hoped. But when he reflected on those choices, he would sometimes mention Walker as a counterpoint. Walker had never seemed concerned with fighting age. He let himself age naturally, and somehow that made him seem even more dignified and powerful. While other actors were desperately clinging to their youth, Walker simply evolved, carrying his strength and presence into his later years without apology or artifice. Reynolds came to realize that there was more dignity in Walker's approach than in all the cosmetic interventions Hollywood could offer. It was another lesson in authenticity, in being comfortable with who you are at every stage of life. Reynolds admitted he wished he'd learned that lesson earlier, but he was grateful to have had Walker's example to look to, even if he didn't fully appreciate it until later in life. The respect Reynolds had for Walker also extended to Walker's incredible physique, but not in the way you might think. Yes, Reynolds acknowledged that Walker was extraordinarily strong and impressively built. But what fascinated Reynolds was how Walker had achieved and maintained that physicality. Walker didn't spend hours in the gym doing isolated muscle exercises. He didn't follow trendy diet plans or hire personal trainers. He didn't take performance-enhancing substances or obsess over his appearance. Instead, Walker maintained his strength through natural movement, outdoor activities like hiking and horseback riding, and a simple, wholesome approach to eating and living. In an era when bodybuilding was becoming increasingly popular and actors were starting to pursue exaggerated musculature, Walker represented something different. He represented what the human body could look like when it was used for actual work and actual living, rather than just aesthetic purposes. Reynolds found this fascinating and would sometimes contrast Walker's natural strength with the more artificial physiques becoming common in action films. Walker could actually do the things his characters did. His strength was functional, real, and it came from a lifetime of genuine physical activity rather than calculated muscle building. But beyond the physical, beyond even the impressive recovery from death, what Reynolds most admired about Walker was his integrity. In an industry where compromising your principles is often seen as necessary for success, Walker maintained clear boundaries. He turned down roles that conflicted with his values. He refused to participate in on-screen behavior that he felt was gratuitous or exploitative. And he did all of this without being preachy or judgmental toward others who made different choices. He simply knew who he was and what he stood for, and he lived accordingly. Reynolds himself had a more complicated relationship with Hollywood's moral ambiguities. He took roles that pushed boundaries, and he didn't always agree with Walker's more conservative approach to content. But he respected that Walker knew his own mind and lived according to his own code. In fact, Reynolds found it refreshing. In a town full of people who would say or do anything to get ahead, Walker's consistency was like a breath of fresh air. There's a particular anecdote that illustrates this beautifully. During the filming of Sam Whiskey, there was a scene that the director wanted to shoot in a way that Walker felt uncomfortable with. The details don't matter, but Walker politely but firmly explained that he wasn't going to do it that way. The director pushed back, and there was a moment of tension on set. But Walker didn't lose his temper, didn't make threats, didn't storm off dramatically. He simply explained his position calmly and offered alternative approaches that would achieve what the director wanted without crossing Walker's personal boundaries. Reynolds watched this interaction with fascination. Here was a man who was confident enough in himself that he didn't need to be aggressive or dramatic to stand his ground. The director, recognizing that Walker wasn't going to budge and that he wasn't being unreasonable, accepted one of the alternatives. The scene was shot, everyone was satisfied, and there were no hard feelings. Later, Reynolds asked Walker about it, and Walker explained that early in his career, he decided that if he couldn't make a living acting according to his principles, he'd go back to working with his hands. Since he was genuinely willing to walk away from acting if necessary, he never felt desperate or compromised. This freedom, Walker said, made him a better actor because he was never afraid of losing the work. Reynolds absorbed this lesson, though he admitted he didn't always follow it. The fear of losing relevance, of being forgotten, of not being the star anymore, these were powerful motivators in Hollywood, and Reynolds wasn't immune to them. But having Walker's example helped him make better choices more often than he might have otherwise. When Reynolds did stand up for something, when he did turn down a role because it didn't feel right, he would think about Walker and draw strength from knowing that it was possible to have both success and principles. Walker's influence on Reynolds also extended to how they both thought about fame itself. By the mid-70s, Reynolds had become the biggest box office star in the world. He was everywhere, movies, television, magazines. The level of fame was intoxicating and exhausting in equal measure. Reynolds loved the adulation but also struggled with the loss of privacy and the constant pressure to maintain his status. He remembered conversations with Walker about fame, and Walker's perspective was illuminating. Walker had been very famous during the height of Cheyenne's popularity. For several years, he was one of the most recognizable faces on television. But he had never let the fame define him. He lived his life, did his work, and when the show ended, he didn't desperately chase the same level of stardom. He took roles he found interesting, spent time with his family, pursued his interests, and seemed genuinely content. This baffled Reynolds initially. How could someone not want to maintain their place at the top of the Hollywood hierarchy? But as Reynolds grew older and experienced the inevitable decline that comes to all stars eventually, he began to understand Walker's wisdom. The desperate scramble to stay relevant, to remain the biggest star, it was exhausting and ultimately futile. Everyone's time in the spotlight is limited. What matters is what you do with that time and who you are when the spotlight moves on. Walker had figured this out decades earlier, and it allowed him to have a much more peaceful and satisfying relationship with his career and his fame. When Reynolds' own star began to fade in the 80s and 90s, when younger actors took over the action roles and romantic leads, he struggled with it. There were some poor choices, some projects he took mainly for the money, some moments of bitterness. But he also tried to remember Walker's example. He tried to focus on the work itself rather than the status. He tried to find peace with the natural arc of a career and a life. It wasn't always easy, and Reynolds would be the first to admit he didn't handle it as gracefully as Walker would have. But Walker's influence helped, serving as a North Star even when Reynolds couldn't quite follow it. One of the things Reynolds finally revealed about Walker in his later years was how profoundly Walker's faith influenced his life. Walker was a deeply spiritual man, though he rarely spoke about it publicly. He didn't use his faith as a marketing tool or as a way to judge others. It was simply the bedrock of his existence, informing his choices and giving him a peace that Reynolds found remarkable. After Walker's near-death experience, his faith seemed to deepen even further, though again, he didn't make a spectacle of it. Reynolds, who had his own complicated relationship with faith and spirituality, found Walker's quiet devotion compelling. It wasn't performative. It wasn't about appearing righteous or superior. It was genuine, personal, and it gave Walker a centeredness that Reynolds envied. In some of his final interviews before his own death, Reynolds would mention how he wished he'd had more of what Walker had, that unshakable faith and peace. The skiing accident and Walker's recovery also sparked conversations between the two men about mortality and what mattered in life. Walker never dwelled on the fact that he'd been declared dead, but when he did discuss it, he spoke about how the experience had clarified what was important. Fame wasn't important. Wealth wasn't important. What mattered was the love of family and friends, the satisfaction of having lived with integrity, and the hope of what comes after this life. These weren't just pretty words for Walker. They clearly guided how he lived every day after his recovery. Reynolds, hearing these reflections, began to reconsider his own priorities. He didn't change overnight, and he certainly didn't give up on his career or stop enjoying his success. But he did start to put more emphasis on relationships, on mending fences with people he'd had conflicts with, on being present for the people he loved. He credited Walker with helping him see that there was more to life than the next role or the next hit film. Another aspect of their relationship that Reynolds eventually opened up about was the way Walker had supported him during difficult times without being asked. When Reynolds was going through his very public divorce from Lonnie Anderson, a period that was tabloid fodder and personally devastating, Walker reached out. Not to gossip, not to take sides, but simply to let Reynolds know he was thinking of him and praying for him. It was a small gesture in some ways, but it meant everything to Reynolds at a time when he felt like the whole world was watching his life fall apart. Walker never discussed Reynolds' personal problems with anyone else. He didn't give interviews offering his opinion on the situation. He just privately supported a friend who was hurting. This discretion, this loyalty, this refusal to capitalize on someone else's pain for attention or relevance, it was vintage Walker, and Reynolds never forgot it. Years later, Reynolds would say that you could judge a person's character by how they treat you when you're down, when you can't do anything for them, when the friendship offers them nothing but the burden of your problems. By that measure, Walker's character was impeccable. As both men aged, their friendship deepened. They had weathered enough years and enough challenges to have a bond that went beyond Hollywood's superficiality. When they got together, which admittedly wasn't as often as Reynolds wished given the demands of their lives and the geography between them, they could talk about anything. Walker would ask about Reynolds' latest project or his personal life, always with genuine interest and never with judgment. Reynolds would marvel at how Walker had maintained such consistency throughout his life, how he seemed unaffected by the decades and the changes in the industry. One thing Reynolds noticed was that Walker never seemed bitter about the changes in Hollywood. By the time the 80s and 90s came around, the kind of Western heroes Walker had played were out of fashion. The industry had moved toward anti-heroes, darker stories, more cynical perspectives. Walker could have been resentful. His whole career had been built on playing a certain kind of character, and those characters were now seen as old-fashioned or even naive. But Walker didn't complain. He took the work he wanted, lived his life, and seemed perfectly content. Meanwhile, Reynolds saw other actors from their era become increasingly bitter about being passed over or forgotten. Walker's grace in handling his career's twilight was another lesson Reynolds tried to internalize. Reynolds himself struggled more publicly with aging and relevance. He made some questionable career choices trying to stay current. He dealt with financial problems that became public knowledge. He had health issues that affected his work and his life. And through all of it, Walker remained a friend and a quiet source of wisdom. Reynolds didn't always follow that wisdom, but he always appreciated it. When Clint Walker passed away in 2018 at the age of 90, Reynolds was devastated. He'd lost not just a friend, but someone he genuinely looked up to, which is rare for someone of Reynolds' stature. Reynolds himself would die just months later, in September of 2018, but before he passed, he made sure to speak about Walker in a way he never quite had before. He didn't just talk about Walker's physical strength or his impressive career. He talked about the man himself, about the integrity, the faith, the authenticity, the quiet power that defined who Clint Walker was. Reynolds said something in one of his final interviews that perfectly captured what Walker meant to him. He said that Hollywood is full of people pretending to be strong, pretending to be tough, pretending to be good men. But Clint Walker never had to pretend anything. He was strong, he was tough, and he was a genuinely good man through and through. Reynolds said that in all his years in the industry, with all the amazing people he'd met and worked with, Clint Walker stood out as possibly the most complete human being he'd ever known. Coming from someone like Burt Reynolds, who worked with virtually every major star of his era, that's an extraordinary statement. Reynolds wasn't someone who gave out compliments lightly. He could be critical, even harsh, about people he felt were phonies or posers. But when he talked about Walker, there was only admiration, respect, and genuine affection. The final thing Reynolds revealed about Walker was perhaps the most personal. He said that whenever he was facing a difficult decision or going through a hard time, he would think about what Clint Walker would do. Not what a character like Cheyenne would do, but what the actual man, Clint Walker, would do. How would he handle this situation? What would his principles tell him? What choice would leave him able to look at himself in the mirror without shame? Reynolds said that this mental exercise, imagining Walker's response, helped guide him toward better choices more times than he could count. This, ultimately, is the greatest compliment one person can give another. To say that someone's example was so powerful, their integrity so clear, their character so admirable, that you use them as a moral compass. Reynolds, for all his fame and success, recognized that Walker possessed something he struggled to attain. And rather than being jealous or dismissive, Reynolds honored it by trying to learn from it, even imperfectly. The story of Burt Reynolds and Clint Walker isn't a dramatic tale of conflict and reconciliation. It's not full of scandal or shocking revelations. But in some ways, that's what makes it so powerful. This is a story about genuine respect between two men who understood that real strength isn't about muscles or machismo. It's about integrity, consistency, faith, and treating people with dignity regardless of their status or what they can do for you. Walker taught Reynolds, and through Reynolds' eventual openness, taught all of us that you don't have to compromise who you are to be successful. You don't have to play the game by rules that violate your values. You don't have to lose yourself in pursuit of fame or fortune. You can be strong without being cruel, confident without being arrogant, successful without being corrupted. Walker lived this truth every single day of his life, from his hardscrabble childhood through his accidental discovery by Hollywood, through his years of fame, through his literal death and resurrection, and into his peaceful later years. And Burt Reynolds, who lived a very different kind of life, who made different choices and walked a different path, recognized the value of Walker's example. He may not have always followed it, but he never stopped admiring it, learning from it, and trying to incorporate its lessons into his own journey. This is why Reynolds finally broke his silence about Walker. Not to generate headlines or sell books or create controversy, but because when you've been blessed to know someone truly exceptional, someone who makes you want to be better just by their example, you owe it to them and to the world to tell the truth about who they were. Reynolds wanted people to understand that Clint Walker wasn't just a television cowboy or a strong man or a lucky survivor of a freak accident. He was a complete human being who lived with extraordinary integrity and grace. In the end, the relationship between Burt Reynolds and Clint Walker is a reminder of what Hollywood could be at its best and what humanity can be at its best. It's a reminder that real friendships can exist even in an industry known for fake smiles and shallow connections. It's a reminder that real strength comes from character, not just physique. It's a reminder that you can remain true to yourself even when surrounded by people telling you to compromise. Clint Walker never set out to be anyone's hero or anyone's role model. He just set out to be himself, to live according to his values, and to do his work with professionalism and integrity. But in doing so, he became exactly the kind of hero the world needs. Not a superhero with impossible powers, but a real person who showed that it's possible to be strong and gentle, confident and humble, successful and grounded, famous and authentic. And Burt Reynolds, by finally speaking openly about his admiration for Walker, gave us all a gift. He pulled back the curtain on a friendship that exemplified the best of what men can be to each other. Not competitors, not rivals, but friends who make each other better. Not jealous of each other's strengths, but celebrating them. Not tearing each other down, but building each other up. This is the story that needed to be told. This is why it mattered that Reynolds finally broke his silence about Clint Walker. Because in a world that desperately needs examples of real integrity, real strength, and real masculinity, Clint Walker's life stands as a testament to what's possible. And Burt Reynolds, by honoring his friend's memory with honest, heartfelt admiration, ensured that Walker's example would continue to inspire long after both men had passed. The silence has been broken. The truth has been told. And what a beautiful truth it is. Two Hollywood legends, two very different men, connected by mutual respect and genuine friendship. One who came back from death itself, and one who learned from that miraculous survivor what it truly means to live. This is the legacy of Clint Walker and Burt Reynolds. Not just the films they made or the characters they played, but the example they set and the lessons they taught about being real men in a world of illusions.